Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala Rasulillah amma ba'd. A'udhu billahi min ash-shaytan ar-rajim. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Siru fil ard. Fanduru kayfa kana aqibatu al-mukaththibin. Qala Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Ballighu anni walau aya. Respected brothers and sisters, thank you very much for being present to listen to this lecture. And today we will be talking about a fascinating episode from Muslim history, and that is the civilization of Islam in the Indian subcontinent. Many Muslims are unaware of what happened in India, despite the richness of the history of Islam in that continent or subcontinent. The reason is that the emphasis, the focus has been on the Middle East. Many people know about the Crusades. People are aware of the Umayyad and the Abbasid dynasties and the Ayyubids and the Seljuks. But very little study has been done, unfortunately, to date on Indian Islam or Islam in India or Islam in the Indian subcontinent. Today, I will be delivering a lecture which is an introduction, a short introduction to what happened in India as far as the Muslims are concerned. And this introduction is very, very brief. The purpose of this introduction is to highlight as to the fascinating nature of Muslim contribution to the Muslim Indian civilization. Muslims achieved great things in India. Very often you hear rhetoric on the news or possibly in the newspapers or even in academic, pseudo-academic writings that Islam is all about invasions in India in particular. It's all about massacres of Hindus, temple desecrations, intolerance towards the non-Muslims, and the list goes on. This is a very powerful rhetoric pumped out in journals, in poorly researched books, biased, prejudiced books, in news reports, on documentaries, all over the place. And the purpose is Islamophobia, to spread hatred of Muslims, which is taking place right now in the West in particular and globally in general. So to counter all this powerful rhetoric against you, why do I call it powerful? It is powerful because to date, there is no systematic response to it. Unfortunately, the Muslims have been very slow in responding to this injustice. And one of the best ways to respond to this injustice is to actually study your history. Learn about it so that you can talk about it. Our history, the history of Islam, is magnificent. It is amazing. It is mind-blowing. It is so fascinating that once we start talking about it, you will start to think, where was I for all those years? Why didn't I study this? Why am I studying engineering? Why am I studying law? Why am I studying accountancy? Why am I studying all these things? Why am I not studying my history? Because a lot of the people nowadays, when they study, they think of the stomach. They think of the stomach. How do we fill our stomach? Why do you study? Have you ever asked yourself this question? Why do you come to the university? What is the purpose? What are you doing here in this institution? The purpose, in the case of over 90% of people here, is what? To make a career, to get a better job, so that I don't starve, right? This is how people think, to put it in crude terms. There may be some exceptions out there, people who are intelligent, who are wise, who have been advised as to the purpose, the true purpose of education. They will tell you, no, we are here for intellectual stimulation. We are here to learn, to enrich ourselves with knowledge so that we become wiser, so that we become better people, so that we are a source of making this planet a better place. And that is the true purpose of education. In fact, Muslims, amazingly, were the most bookly people in the world. Muslims for over 1,000 years led education in all fields. When I say all fields, you name it, all fields available to humanity for over 1,000 years, we mastered all those fields and we taught them as masters, as professors, as lecturers, as teachers. You name it, philosophy, science, whatever primitive form it was known to humanity, in history, any other field you can think of. Medicine, optics, surgery, alchemia or chemistry, mathematics. We can go on and on and on and talk about Muslim civilization in Al-Andalus, in the Middle East, in Baghdad, and in other places in North Africa. But today we will be talking about what happened in India. And the purpose is to highlight the magnificence of our history. Of course there are problems in our history. Of course there are unpleasant incidents and events in our history. But are they because of Islam? No. They are because of greed. What we call human weakness. Humans are vulnerable to temptations. They do bad things at different times in different places. So today, India is the focus, so that we can all learn about what Muslims did in India. And to make the final point of my introduction, the importance of history is paramount. As I said earlier, the Muslims were the most bookly people on the planet. We had the largest libraries in the world. Our libraries were so huge that we still have manuscripts lying around in book markets. They ran into millions of books, handwritten by people. So big this tradition was that even the non-Muslims were inspired to imitate Muslims in book collecting, book writing, becoming scribes, book decorating, book binding, you name it. It was all about books. Book markets in medieval Islam were the busiest places. Today, when you go to the Muslim world, what are the busiest places? What are they? No. There's another market, right? What are the busiest places in the Muslim lands? Malls, where you have designer stores, right? Louis Vuitton, Gucci. Yeah, this is what Muslims are dying for, right? This is what we are investing in our lands. We are building skyscrapers, we're building malls, we're putting commodities in there as if this is what life is about. No, we have lost the plot. As a civilization, unfortunately, we have left our ways, we have lost the plot. The first command which came to the Muslims was what? Iqra. Bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq. خلق الإنسان من علق اقرأ وربك الأكرم الذي علم بالقلم علم الإنسان ما لم يعلم. The very first 5 verses to be revealed to humanity in the Quran, the last and the final message to humanity, were about knowledge, reading, writing, use of qalam, use of reading, use of books. Yes? What happened? It wasn't about designer clothes. It was not about buying flashy cars or getting degrees so that you can have a nice house and that's what you live for. No, the purpose of life is not that, especially for Muslims. The purpose of Muslim life is to make this planet a better place by educating yourself, primarily in your own tradition and then other traditions, so that you can be great contributors as we were in the past. And it can be repeated once you learn about it. If it was done right in the past, it can be done right today. You all agree? Not everything about history was bad. Not everything about history was embarrassing. No, we have magnificent things to be proud of. So we have become the most bookless people on the planet. From a very bookly people, we have lost value for books. And the first step to improvement is to highlight the problem and to acknowledge the problem. Once we acknowledge the problem, we will start moving towards improvement. So brothers and sisters who are listening to me right now, know this is the problem. You think doing a degree, which is at best introductory, you do not become scholars by doing a bachelor's. You do not become scholars. Don't get this wrong. Degree is not the end, it's the means. A degree which you are doing in this university is not the ends. People think I'm going to spend 4 years and that's it. My life with education is done. Now I am educated. No, you're still a baby. You're not educated. You think when you do a degree you're educated? No. Education starts after the master's. It starts after you do postgraduate. That's when you go into the depth of what you have learnt. That's when you start to explore territories which you cannot understand before. Degree is little knowledge, introduction. So don't be satisfied by your degree which you have done for your stomach so that you can put pizza, burgers and fries in your stomach and get fat. I just had a very nice pizza, by the way. I'm not against pizzas. Sheffield pizzas are very nice, by the way. Okay? It is about feeding your brain, not your stomachs. Education is for feeding your brain, your mind. So, having had my emotional rant, as usual in the beginning, we're going to get on with the topic. India. What happened in India? Firstly, the first emergence of Islam in India happened through traders. We are told Yemeni traders who inhabited the west coast of India, and some of their descendants are still living there. In fact, the dress code is very similar as well. And the language is very close to the Arabic language, although it has changed throughout time. But the Yemeni traders were the first people to have emerged on the Indian scene. Then came the armies of Hajjaj bin Yusuf, led by a man called Muhammad bin Qasim. What was the reason? Historians have debated a number of times, in a number of ways. Some historians believe the Islamic traditional view or the Islamic historical traditional view that a ship carrying Muslim women and men and children was attacked by some pirates near the territory today called Sindh in Pakistan, and these prisoners were carried into that territory, and Hajjaj bin Yusuf heard about it, who was the governor of Iraq at the time, who was a very tyrannical, oppressive man who was responsible for killing thousands of Muslims. He was informed about this particular incident, and he asked the king of the region, who was called Raja Dahir, the king Dahir, and the king refused. He said, I cannot help you in any way. And as a result, Hajjaj bin Yusuf sent in an army of 5,000 men, led by Muhammad bin Qasim al-Thaqafi. He was from Banu Thaqif. So was Hajjaj bin Yusuf. And cut the long story short, he came, he campaigned for 2 years, he took a large territory, he fought a battle against the king himself, Raja Dahir, and the king was killed in battle. The king was a Hindu king, Brahmin, and a large portion of the population at the time was Buddhist. The Buddhists were actually ousted by the Brahmins through wars, killings, persecution, everything put together. So, when Muslims came in, the Brahmins were in power, and the Buddhists welcomed the Muslims because they were suffering from persecution. So they welcomed the Muslims naturally. So that made the rapid spread of Islam or Islamic territory or Muslim territory in Sindh very easy. And after establishing the state, Muhammad bin Qasim was called back by Sulaiman bin Abdul Malik, who came to power in Damascus. Political leadership had changed because Sulaiman was the brother of Walid bin Abdul Malik, who was an Umayyad caliph before Sulaiman. And Walid was responsible for sending all these generals to conduct conquests in all these far away lands. Okay, so Walid's generals were fighting in Spain. Who was that? Anyone knows the name? Sorry? Very close. Yes, that's the man. Anyone else knows the name of the general who went to Spain? Tariq bin Ziyad. You know Gibraltar? Who knows Gibraltar? Hello? Put your hands up. Do you know where Gibraltar is? You know where it is? It is in Spain, but it is Britain. Okay? It is Britain. Gibraltar is actually, the word Gibraltar is a corruption of Jabalul Tariq, the mountain of Tariq. This is the rock, or this is the mount upon which Tariq landed with his army. Okay? And that story, which is attributed to him, that he delivered a lavish or a very emotional speech in front of his people, his army. And then what did he do? What's the story? Does anyone know? He burnt his ships. Have you heard about this? This story is not true. There is no evidence for this story, by the way. This story is falsely attributed to him. We don't have any historical sources to confirm this story. Okay? So Tariq bin Ziyad was actually an associate of Musa bin Nusayr, who was the general conducting the business of expansion in North Africa. And he was working on behalf of Walid bin Abdul Malik, the caliph, very powerful Umayyad caliph in Damascus. On the other hand, you have Qutayba bin Muslim in northern China, very close to northern China. This is a very large stretch of land from Spain to northern China. Do you know what that is? If a plane flies today from China going to Morocco, how long does it take? Easily 10 hours, right? Possibly more, right? Okay? This is how far the generals were. And in the south, now Muhammad bin Qasim was representing Walid bin Abdul Malik. But when power changed in Damascus, Sulaiman, the brother of Walid, came to power, and he had vendetta against the generals of his brother, and he called them all back. Cut the long story short, they were killed off. They were finished. And that kind of checked the progress of Muslim military expansion in India, in Sindh. And then during the Abbasid period, in particular, the period of Khalifa al-Mansur. Al-Mansur was the same Khalifa who was alive at the time of Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullah alayh, and when Imam al-Shafi'i was a child. Al-Mansur was governing Baghdad. He was a very powerful caliph. The Abbasids had completely removed the Umayyads from power, and they had come to power. So during the Abbasid period, the raids into the Indian territory, at that time known as Sindh, okay, reinitiated or reignited. So again some territory was taken, and cut the long story short, up to the city of Multan, which is in current day Pakistan. Multan is southern Punjab. If you look at the Pakistani map today, you will see a city called Multan. Up to Multan, the Muslim armies reached, and they established some sub-states, and the Arabs were governing these states. The coins, when you find them, they have Arabic on them. So this was a very Arabized state, okay, in Sindh, right? Jizya was applied. People were given freedom to practice their religion. At times there were wars, there were battles. So Muslims governed tactfully. They bought alliances, they bribed alliances, they fought alliances, they did all these things, what is necessary for politics, which any other king or group would do. But then some Ismailis, we have to take long leaps, historically speaking, of centuries, because we are missing sources, unfortunately. One of the earliest sources we have on the first expedition into Hind or Sindh. Okay, Sindh was a province, a small part of Hind. Hind was known as India at the time. This is how the Arabs knew the Indian territory. As far as they were concerned, Sindh was actually Hind, because that's all they had seen of Hind, right? They had no idea what Delhi is, or what Hyderabad is, or what other part, Calcutta. They had no idea if anything is there. They have never seen it. They don't know. The only part of Hind they know is Sindh, which is very, very close to Arabia, which was very close to a place called Makran, where the Arabs had already established their garrison towns, and they had taken a lot of land in Persia, right? So the only part of India they know is the part that is directly attached by land to some of Persia, or some part of Persia, which is today called Balochistan, right? Or Sajistan area. So the only source we have on this particular episode of history is called Chachnama. Chach was the father of King Dahir, and the source is named after him. Unfortunately, Chachnama is quite late. It is from the 13th century, and it's not fully trustworthy. Another source we have on the excursions of Muhammad bin Qasim is Futuh al-Buldan of Imam Baladuri, who has written a very early history of conquest. Literally translated, Futuh al-Buldan means the conquest of lands. Okay, and in this book, Imam Baladuri collects all the reports on the conquest of, for example, Palestine, the conquest of Egypt, the conquest of Syria, the conquest of Sindh at the hands of Muhammad bin Qasim. Unfortunately, Futuh al-Buldan is also 2 centuries late, but it traces back its information in the 1st century, from 1st century sources. So we don't know much about what happened afterwards. Unfortunately, the only sources we have available to us about the Arab rulers of Sindh in India, at that time India, are coins. The only source we have are coins minted by them, and some of the names of the governors and generals are on the coins. Some of them are very cute, very little, tiny, less than half a gram. They are called Habari dirhams. If you Google them, you will see exactly what I'm talking about. They're very small, tiny. They're possibly the tiniest Muslim coins ever, right? Very small silver coins, less than half a gram, 0.30 gram. Okay, and you have the names of these governors who were obviously Arabs: Abdurrahman, Umar, okay, Ali, Abdullah, Ubaidullah. These are the names there on the coins. I forgot to bring them with me because I collect coins, and I have a collection of these coins as well. And you can easily find them in coin markets. So for the next 3 centuries, we don't have any sources, unfortunately. Cut the long story short, what happened after the decline of the Arab power in Sindh? Some of the Ismailis, who were also known as Karamita, they had gained a lot of power in the Middle East. Egypt was occupied by the Fatimids. Fatimids were, they claimed to be the descendants of Fatima radiallahu anha. They also called themselves Alawites, okay, the children of Ali, and they claimed direct descent from the children of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And on those bases, they had established this government, which was Shia in origin, but they followed an esoteric version of Shiaism, which was Bataniya. In the Arabic language, you call it Bataniya. Okay, they had hidden meanings. They read hidden meanings into the Quran. They believed that Quran has hidden meanings, and only the best and the elitist of the Muslims, which were the Ahlul Bayt or the children of Ali, only they could read those meanings into the Quran. And they were a very dangerous group of people. They were also called Nazaris, and they were a menace for a very long time for a number of political leaders, and they assassinated a number of political leaders, including crusaders. Even as late as the Crusades, Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi, his own life was threatened. There was an attempt made on his life by one of the Nazaris who tried to kill him. Okay, so Nazaris were a menace for every single political power that governed the region. They had established a stronghold in Multan, in Sindh at that time, because they found weakness. Some of the du'at were sent from Yemen because the Fatimids had become very strong in Yemen also. And what you see in Yemen today nowadays, the Houthis and other groups who attribute themselves to the Shia school of thought, they are possibly the remnants of these influences that were there. So from Yemen, Du'at were sent into Sindh to preach the doctrine of the Fatimids, the Ismailis or the Nazaris, and they became very strongly established. And Nazaris had made a mission in their life or their lives to dismantle the Abbasid Caliphate. The biggest purpose of activity was to dismantle the Abbasid Caliphate of Baghdad. That was point number 1 on the manifesto. You know manifesto? Something you want to do or something you do, right? Like the Christchurch killer, he had a manifesto and he published it before he committed his barbaric atrocity. So Nazaris were a very dangerous people. They were possibly the first terrorists in human history. They terrorized people by using very unpleasant, unconventional tactics to kill, assassinate people, right? If they had got their hands on bombs at that time, they would have caused a lot more damage to Muslims and other people. Okay, so they were also known as Qaramita. So they had established a stronghold in India, in Sindh, in Multan, out of all places, amazingly, and they had become a menace for the Abbasids. So at that time, another power arose in the north, in the region today called Afghanistan. There was a city called Ghazni. Today it's called Ghazni. In the past, it was called Ghazna, right? Now, another power had emerged in Central Asia. These were Turkic slaves bought from slave markets in Central Asia, and they were trained into military arts, and they were employed by political powers in the Middle East and beyond for military purposes. Is that clear? And this process started in the 10th century. It reached its peak in the 10th century. Many of these Turkic slaves who were bought from Central Asian markets, trained into military arts, became powerful men. Within the state apparatus, they rose to higher positions, and at times they became the sultans themselves. They became more powerful than the Caliph of Baghdad. Seljuks were a group known of these people. Now, in the 10th century, the Caliphs of Baghdad were completely overpowered by a Shia group called Buyids, right? And Buyids were actually ousted by the Seljuks, who were Sunni, Turkic generals who came to power, and they came to rescue the Caliph of Baghdad, right? And in the 10th century, the Seljuks became the heroes of Islam, the defenders of Sunni Orthodox Islam, right? This is what happened. And from a branch of the Seljuks came a family called the Samanids, and a Turkic slave called Sabuktakin became the ruler of this land called Ghazna, and he established a huge government in this city called Ghazna, and he himself was Turkic. He came from Central Asia, and he governed from 1077 to 1097, almost 20 years. Now, why am I talking about Sabuktakin? Sabuktakin is mentioned because of his son, very famous conqueror in the early history of Indian Islam. His name is Sultan Mahmud Ghaznavi. Sultan Mahmud Ghaznavi was the son of Sabuktakin, who came to power in 1099, and he died in 1030. So almost 30 years of his reign, he conducted 17 raids into northern India. 17 raids into northern India. Now, this is the first time on this scale Muslims' armies have approached India from the north. Sindh is in the south. And who approached Sindh from the south? Who? Muhammad bin Qasim, who was what? Ethnically? Arab. He was Thaqafi. He was not Yemeni. He was from Banu Thaqif. He was from Banu Thaqif, the tribe very close to Mecca, Taif, the city of Taif was inhabited by the Thaqafis. Hajjaj bin Yusuf was also a Thaqafi. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said there will be two liars. Yes? No, there will be a liar and there will be an oppressor. I think the hadith stated two liars will come from Banu Thaqif. One was Mukhtar al-Thaqafi and the other one was Hajjaj bin Yusuf, who killed many great personalities in the early history of Islam. You're not getting bored, are you? We're getting to the interesting part very soon, inshallah. I'm going to cut the political history short and we're going to get to the civilization of Islam in India very quickly, inshallah. Political history is very important to understand the dynamics of what actually happened and why it happened. Sultan Mahmud Ghaznavi, the son of Sabuktakin, who was a Turkic slave who became the Sultan himself. So Mahmud was his son, who was a very powerful leader. He became so powerful that he was threatening the Caliph directly, Al-Qadir Billah, who was the Caliph in Baghdad. So if you pick up coins of Mahmud Ghaznavi, you will see his title on the coins. Okay, Yaminul Khilafa. Okay, Nasiru Amir al-Mu'mineen, Al-Qadir Billah. This is the title of Sultan Mahmud Ghaznavi on his coins. And you find his coins in abundance in Afghanistan to this day, right? Because he was so rich. And how did he become rich? He became rich by attacking other territories. This is exactly what kings would do. It wasn't done necessarily for Islamic reasons. A lot of chroniclers, a lot of historians at the time writing panegyrics for Mahmud Ghaznavi, or later on, he was painted as the conqueror of Islam against Hinduism, right? By later historians. But that wasn't necessarily the case. Because sometimes people read their perceptions or their current perceptions into the past. Does that make sense? Sometimes we read our current perceptions into the past. Sometimes we judge people of the past by our current standards. That particular method of looking at the past is actually wrong, mistaken, misplaced. That system is called anachronism, when you use your current standard to judge a personality from the past. For example, a very quick example of this, Prophet's marriage to Aisha radiallahu anha. Very often you hear it in the mouths of Islamophobes, Islam haters, who deliberately ignore the context, ignore the entire history of humanity, and they attack the Prophet by our standards today. Right? In the past, people would get married to younger women. As soon as girls hit puberty, they were ready for marriage, as far as those people were concerned. Why? Partly because life expectancy was very low. Women would usually die very young in childbirth, right? Or from other problems. There were no medical facilities. Women die young today in so-called third world countries like India. Okay, like in some countries like in Africa. Basic medicine is not available. Women die in the 20s, in the teenage, or even in the 30s. This was happening in the past, and this was one of the reasons why they would get married to younger women. Now we use our standard today. Some of the Islamophobes deliberately ignoring all the history, and they project their perception onto the Prophet ﷺ. This is what happened in Muslim history, unfortunately, as well, that Sultan Mahmud Ghaznavi was read later on by Muslim historians of the 13th century and beyond as the Muslim hero who opened India for the Muslims. But he was not necessarily doing it for Islam, although he claimed it. Because you see, propaganda is a very powerful tool. You all agree? Yes? All people at all times use propaganda. I'll give you current examples to understand. So how were the medieval Muslim kings inflating their image as the conqueror of Islam, or conqueror for Islam? Right? The Mujahid fi Sabilillah. Right? The hero of Islam. they would use propaganda. How? In the khutbahs, they would be praised. On Friday, on their coins, they would put their titles. For example, Mahmud Ghaznavi, on some of his coins, you read But Shakan in the Persian language, which means the breaker of the idols. Right? So he presented himself as the hero because he was breaking idols. Not that he was alone in doing this. Breaking idols was an Indian phenomenon. It was happening in India before the Muslims came. Hindus who belong to different cults or different understandings of their deities, because Hindus worship different deities. They have different deities, different sects, and for that reason they attacked each other in the past and they destroyed each other's temples and idols. So when a lot of these Islamophobes or Islam haters nowadays talk about Muslim history in India, they point to one phenomenon, and that phenomenon is temple desecrations. Temple desecrations was actually not an invention of Islam and Muslims. It was not. To the contrary, we have evidence that Muslims left those temples alone that had no political significance as such at the time. Because temples in India were symbols of power. The power of the king and the state was directly linked to the deity in the temple. And this is exactly what was the case with the Greek mythology. You see, if you watch this movie, Troy, Brad Pitt. I like to watch these historic movies, yeah? When Achilles, the Greek mythical hero, attacks Troy, the first thing he does is goes to the temple of Apollo and he cuts off the head of the idol to demoralize the enemy, the army of the enemy. This is exactly what was happening in India. In India, Hindu kings would invade other territories, Hindu territories, and these Hindus would be worshipping a different deity. And one Hindu king would raid another Hindu territory, and the first thing that Hindu king would do is to go to the temple, destroy the deity, burn the temple down, and that would demoralize the entire army of the enemy. Because now the god is dead. The God has been killed and destroyed and desecrated. What's the point of fighting now? I mean, God is not with us. Khalas, finished. Game over. God has abandoned us. This is how it worked. And this is one of the reasons why it was used as a weapon of war during the Middle Ages by Muslims and Hindus. Okay? So, to point at Muslims only, which is what happens nowadays, to mention grooming gangs, as an example today. I like to give examples, current examples, so that you can actually understand history better. Grooming gangs. Who is the finger pointing at in newspapers? Hello? Muslims. Am I exaggerating? You live in the north, you know better than I. Yes? Yeah. Rotherham and the other place, Rochdale. Who is the finger pointing at? Muslims. They call them Muslim grooming gangs. They have even given them a religious title, amazingly. They are Muslim grooming gangs. But how Muslim are these Muslim grooming gangs is the question. Other than their names, they have no connection to Islam. Right? And especially when we study the statistics in Britain of pedophilia and grooming, proportionally speaking, when we look at the Muslim population and the native English population or British population of Britain, proportionally speaking, the whites are the majority of grooming gangs. They are the majority of groomers. They are the majority of pedophiles. This is statistically proven. Hundreds of thousands of whites travel to Philippines, Cambodia, Vietnam to have sex with children. So the focus has been removed from them, the real culprits. If we want to talk about this problem, then we have to talk about it in a just fashion. We cannot just ignore the elephant in the room and magnify the ants. Do you all agree? Okay, if I magnify the ant and make it look like the elephant, what are you going to tell me? And there's a big elephant and Not an Indian elephant, an African elephant. Yeah? You know, African elephants are big, by the way. They are nearly, if an Indian elephant is as high as this roof, the African elephant is probably going to be 3 feet taller, you know, and they cannot be tamed. A lesson on elephants as well, because elephants are very important in Indian history. The armies and militaries use them. And I was recently in South Africa and I took some footage, a selfie with an African elephant. And a lot of people told me afterwards, you were crazy, you were mad, because these elephants are not tamed. They cannot be tamed. They are wild elephants. You know, they can attack you anytime. Alhamdulillah, I'm here, I survived. So, grooming gangs. The finger is pointing at Muslims. Unfairly, unjustly, because they want, those who are pointing the finger, they want to magnify the problem by highlighting the culprits who are actually not, who actually don't represent the majority of culprits. The majority comes from a different background, but they are completely ignored in media. Have you ever seen a news headline or a newspaper headline stating white English grooming gangs active in Cambodia? White English Christian or / atheist grooming gangs in Vietnam? No? Have you ever come across any headline like that? White English Christian / atheist grooming gangs active online? No? No? But they are the majority. Not because the majority of the population is English or British. No, not because of that. I said proportionally. Proportionally. When you look at Muslim population and when you look at the English, when you do the proportions according to the numbers, still the majority are from the English or the white background in Britain. And I'm not trying to, cause hate here or trouble here. This is a fact. This is what we're dealing with nowadays, unfortunately. Why did I come to this point in the first place? Please do remind me to go back to the initial point. Why did I mention grooming gangs? Oh, pointing of the finger. That temple desecrations is a Muslim speciality. Muslims specialized in temple desecrations. They knew how to remove the blocks professionally from temples. They knew how to slice the idols. But this was not a Muslim monopoly. It was happening in India across the board. And Richard Eaton is a very good scholar from the US who has written extensively on temple desecrations in India. If you Google Richard Eaton, Richard E-A-T-O-N, Eaton, and then temple desecrations. Google Richard Eaton, temple desecrations. You will see articles on temple desecrations in India and you will see exactly what the reality is. So you need to learn your history. You need to understand these things. Likewise, Mahmud Ghaznavi, who came into India, he was invading this territory to accumulate wealth. And he used propaganda to be successful, to recruit more volunteers from surrounding countries. And you know, when the call of jihad was made, many volunteers came and joined the armies. And they came into India, and not necessarily, as far as the king was concerned, for the sake of Allah or for the sake of Islam. It was partly because they wanted to accumulate wealth, as kings did in the Middle Ages. During the Middle Ages, medieval period, there were no rules and regulations. There was no United Nations. There were no Geneva Conventions or Bill of Rights or anything like that. These people, they did as they went along. Basically, they made their minds up. They decided things as they went along. Right? So Mahmud Ghaznavi raided 17 times and he destroyed one particular temple called Somnath in Gujarat, in the current day region called Gujarat. Okay, so this was the first time when some Muslim armies approached India from the north. And Lahore, have you heard of the city called Lahore? It's in current day Pakistan. Became the capital, the Ghaznavid capital in India. The first Muslim stronghold in northern India was Lahore, amazingly. A lot of people don't know this, by the way. Lahore became the first Muslim stronghold. Again, gradually the Ghaznavid power declined, and after the Ghaznavid, another power arose in the 12th century called the Ghawrids, okay, led by a man called Mu'izzuddin Muhammad bin Sam. Shahabuddin Ghori. Okay, and he was called Ghori because he came from a region in Afghanistan called Ghor. Okay, and Afghanis have a long history when we talk about India and India and Afghanistan. Most invasions from the north came through Afghanistan, and they came from Khyber Pass, which is in current day Pakistan, by the way. Right? So these armies came, they defeated some Hindu kings in the north, in particular a king called Prithvi Raj Chauhan. He was defeated in a battle, the Battle of Tarain, and the Muslim power was established in the north, in the city of Delhi. Now the slave kings came to power, literally called slave kings. Okay, this is when the real power play started as far as the Muslims are concerned in India, when the Muslims became real political players in the political or the military landscape of India. When did this happen? If you want to take one date, I would say 1200. Easy to remember. What date? 1200. Easy to remember. Why 1200? Because this is the time when the rise of the Muslim power in northern India actually took a significant form. And this started with, again, Ghori, Shahabuddin Ghori, who had a number of Turkic slaves under him serving as generals. So again, remember the tradition of buying slaves from Central Asia and training them in military arts for them to become expert soldiers, fighters, generals, tacticians, all these things, right? So these Turkic slaves who were very good at fighting wars, especially when we look at the medieval warfare, they brought a lot of expertise with them. So he had a huge number of slaves bought from Turkic regions, Central Asia. Okay, current day Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and what other stans are there? Sorry? Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan. Yes, absolutely. All these stans, right? They were at the time known as Mawarahun Nahar. Mawarahun Nahar actually means land beyond the river, literally in the Arabic language. Which river? River Oxus. Okay, that separates Afghanistan from Central Asia. Also known as Transaxonia, the region of Transaxonia, right? So these Turkic slaves were bought from these markets in this region, and they were trained in military arts. They became so powerful within the military apparatus that they became sultans. So when Muizzuddin, Shahabuddin, Muhammad bin Sam Ghori was killed by an assassin in his tent. Is there anyone from Pakistan here? I don't think so. What part of Pakistan are you from? Okay, a bit far. You?
My parents from Azad Kashmir.
Azad Kashmir is big. It's a big territory. There's a place called Gujar Khan in Pakistan. Not many people. If you are from there, you would know what I'm talking about. This is where Shahabuddin Ghori was killed in his tent in 1206. And immediately after his assassination, his slave Qutbuddin Aybak or Aybak came to power. The name is very Turkic. He was Turkic. And I can imagine if you saw him, he would look like a Central Asian, have you seen Mongols? Yeah. They have long eyes, flat faces, very distinct features. They look like that. These sultans who were Muslims, they look like that. So he was a Turkic slave. Qutbuddin Aybak was sultan and he governed for 4 years. In 1210, he was playing polo in Lahore and he died having fallen from his horse, and he was buried in Lahore. His tomb is there in Lahore. After him came to power a very important figure, Sultan Iltutmish, Shamsuddin Iltutmish, again a very Turkish name, right? He came to power and he governed for another 26 years, from 1210 to 1236. He came to power, 26 years. And it was in his reign when the Mongols started to kill Muslims. When the Mongol invasions started, Genghis Khan and his army started to invade Muslim territory from the the northeast, okay, from the Mongol territory, Mongolia, current day Mongolia. So Genghis Khan came out to avenge the murders of some Mongol merchants who were killed in the territory of Khwarizm Shah. Khwarizm Shah was the king of a very huge territory consisting of parts of Central Asia, Persia, and the Middle East up to Iraq. He was a very huge king who had become so huge that he had killed all the other kings in these territories. Now, because only he remained as the king, no other kings remained, he could fight the Mongols alone. But he couldn't fight the Mongols alone. That was the problem. When the Mongols came in, he was on the run. And when he eventually got killed or died, the Mongols had taken all that territory. Now, what happened? India, the Indian Islam, what happened as far as the Muslim civilization in India is concerned is directly linked to Mongol invasions, amazingly. If Mongols did not invade Central Asia, which was predominantly Muslim at the time, the cities of Bukhara and Samarkand, Ibn al-Athir, who was a famous historian writing in the 13th century, early 13th century, who also wrote about Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi and the history of the Crusades, he wrote about the Mongol invasions because he met refugees. It's like one of you goes to some of the Syrian refugee camps in Jordan or in Lebanon, and you meet some of these Syrian refugees and you see the difficulties they've gone through. You see women who have been raped. You see children who have been, they have bullet wounds. You see things like that, disturbing things like that. Okay? And then you write about it. Your hands will shake, right? Telling the story. This is what Ibn al-Athir writes, that my hands do not have the strength to write what I have witnessed in the refugees who have come from Samarkand and Bukhara. And Ibn al-Athir was writing in Mosul at the time. So Mongol invasions were a catastrophe of a huge scale in Muslim history. And this is what I tell Islamophobes, Islam haters. Islamophobia is a big problem on my mind. Okay? And this is the biggest problem we are facing in Britain, the Muslims of Britain. This is the biggest threat you are facing today, Islamophobia. Okay? And this is why I keep mentioning it. This is why I tell Islamophobes that no matter how hard you try to spread hate against Muslims, we have survived Mongol invasions. We survived Mongol invasions. And you don't know what that is. Once you study the Mongol invasions, you will know exactly what that means. And we will survive this. We will also survive this. Your hate, your lies, your peddling of misrepresentation of our faith is not going to work. It's going to fail. It is going to fail, and we will survive, we will last. This is the promise of Allah to us. And when the Mongol invasions happened, Muslim scholars are saying, this is it. This is Malhama, this is Ya'juj and Ma'juj. It's finished. We are finished. But what happened? These same Mongols, they became the defenders of Islam. They became the defenders of Islam. So from the same people came who? The Ottomans. The Ottomans. It happened in the 13th century. Genghis Khan came in 1219 and he died in 1227, having killed almost 10 million Muslims from East Turkestan up to Syria. And then an army of Mamluks, Saifuddin Qutuz, defeated the Mongols for the first time on that scale, and their advance was checked. Amazingly, the Mamluks, the Turkic slaves who were trained in military arts, have this honor to claim in their history. Both cases where Mongol invasions were stopped and checked, they were stopped by the Mamluks, by slaves bought by Muslim sultans, Muslim kings, trained in military arts. They were the ones who defended and protected the Muslim civilization from destruction, from imminent destruction. Where? One case is Egypt, where again the Mamluks, the slave kings, were governing. Saifuddin Qutuz was a Mamluk, and Baybars after him. And the second case is India, where Sultan Iltutmish, who was governing, when the Mongol invasions happened. And after these invasions, you remember when I mentioned that Indian civilization, Indian Islam owes its existence to Mongol invasions. Sometimes when you see something, some destruction, you see destruction. But Allah has another plan. God has another plan. And you cannot see that plan unfold because you don't live long enough to see that plan. You see what's happening in Syria, what's happening in Burma, for example, with Rohingya Muslims, or what's happening to Christchurch, for example. What happened in Christchurch? A hater, a racist bigot walked into a masjid due to Islamophobia, peddled by a number of pseudo-intellectuals in Britain, in America, in Australia, because he cited all of them, by the way, in his manifesto. He told us who the inspirations are. So I'm not making things up. Am I making things up? Has anyone had the privilege of reading his manifesto? Anyone? You haven't had the privilege? May Allah not give you that privilege. Right? In that manifesto, he actually quotes people. He mentions his inspirations. And there is a direct link between what he did and Islamophobia. So you see Islamophobia, you see hate. This is why I said we will survive this. We will survive this. Why? Because it has another side. After he killed 50 Muslims, do you know how many people have come to Islam in New Zealand and Australia? Any idea? Any idea? He wasn't thinking that, was he? When he went into the mosque, massacred 50 Muslims, he didn't think that his actions will bring thousands of people to Islam. And that's what happened. That's what happened. I have a friend in New Zealand as we speak today. He said people are coming to mosques in drives. Not only the Christchurch mosque, they are going to mosques all over New Zealand. All the New Zealanders, is that how you call them? Kiwis? Right? All the Kiwis are making their way to mosques. And even in Australia, they're going to mosques to ask questions because they sympathize with Muslims. So the more you attack us, the more you will, cause us to grow. We become stronger. The Mongol invasions made Muslims stronger, and this is the point I want to make now. So Mongols were thinking we have destroyed Islam, but they actually made Islam stronger than it was. Where? In India. All the intellectuals, all the philosophers, all the poets, all the theologians, all the historians from Central Asia, all the artists, all the experts in architecture, the cream of the crop from Central Asia. And it's a huge region, from places like Samarkand and Bukhara, from the Farghana Valley, and from Afghanistan. They migrated. They left their region because of Mongol invasions, that destruction. And where did they go? India. They took refuge under the protection of these powerful sultans in India. My God, I've been talking for an hour now. Okay, so we're going to stop very soon and take questions take questions. So I'm going to now summarize very quickly, get to the conclusion. They came to India, and in India, all of these scholars and all of these architects and intellectuals brought their knowledge and their expertise with them. That's why India became such a power that a menace like Mongols could not shake it. For over a century, Muslim sultans from different dynasties governing North India were protecting India against the Mongol invasions. So first, Sultan Ghiyasuddin Balban, another Turkic slave of Sultan Shahabuddin Ghori. After Iltutmish, 1236 he died. His daughter Radhiya Sultana came to power. Radhiya Sultana is a very famous figure in the Indian history, and Indians know about her. She only governed for 4 years, and she was the first Muslim woman ruler of India. She governed for 4 years, and she governed effectively. In fact, Sultan al-Tutmish preferred her over his sons. He used to say, I wish you were a man, that you could become the Sultan after me, because she had all the qualities of the Sultan. But the Turkic governing system these slave sultans had established in India at the time was a very male-dominated system. So these Turkic leaders, chiefs, did not accept her as the ruler. So she was eventually deposed, and then other sons of Iltutmish came to power, but they were weaklings, and then came to power Ghiyasuddin Balban, a very powerful Turkic slave general, again trained in military arts, and he created a huge empire in India, so strong that the Mongols could not break through. He built fortresses in the way of the Mongols. Now, when Indian context is discussed, in India, do you know how much Islamophobia there is in India? Do you know anything about it? In a way that Muslims are attacked on daily basis. The mosques are attacked. Muslims are attacked for slaughtering cows. In the rural areas, Muslims cannot practice their faith. This, in some cases, have to hide their identity. Recently, a case happened where a Hindu mob walked into a Muslim home and they beat up women, children, men, elderly, everyone. It was on video. It was national news in India. It's happening in India on a daily basis because the government of India, the current government, I'm not saying all Indians are like that. There are amazing, beautiful people in India, like there are in Britain, like there are in New Zealand, like there are in the US. They don't agree with the government policy. Because the governments, in some cases, or in these cases I mentioned, are complacent or maybe complicit. You know, they are complicits in this. They are probably part of the problem. They are not taking action against haters. So in India, a lot of Muslims are being persecuted. There's a lot of Islamophobia in India. And it is because, why did I mention Indian Islamophobia? What was I talking about before that?
Tax in India.
Sorry?
Tax in India. We're talking about
Tax.
tax.
Attacks in India. Yeah, but before I mentioned that, what was I talking about? Just before that. What point of history was I at? Sorry? Razia Sultan. Right. Balban. I mentioned Balban. Okay. He became a very powerful son. Nevertheless, I don't know why I mentioned. Okay. But I'm sure there was a point which has complete.
We're talking about how Mongol attacks made Muslims strong.
And then I was talking about Balban. Oh yes. Now I remember. Thank you. Why Muslims are being persecuted in India is because, again, history is being distorted. It is being read selectively, and it is being misconstrued deliberately. It is being taken out of context. In India, pseudo-intellectuals appear on TV programs and they spread hate against Muslims. They tell us that we are not Mughals, we are not Turks, we are Hindus, we are Indians. So the Muslims are actually representatives of Mughals and Turks. They're not Indians. This is the point. Okay? But one thing Muslims don't know about India is that if the Muslim sultans did not stand in the way of the Mongols, do you know what would happen to India? Do you have any idea what the Mongols would do in India? The Indians cannot imagine it. To understand what I'm talking about, just read what they did to land between China and Syria in those 50 years. You know what they did in Baghdad in 1258, the Mongols? In Baghdad, they killed the entire population. They left out the Shias, they left out the Christians, they completely slaughtered the entire population of the Sunnis of Baghdad. So, very quickly, I'm going to have to stop recording as well because my phone is giving me warnings. Okay. So the Mongols were stopped by the Muslim sultans. Muslim sultans stopped the Mongols, and if The Delhi sultans did not stand. The sultans who were slaves initially and they became kings, sultans. In this case, Ghiyasuddin Balban. Ghiyasuddin Balban governed from 1266 to 1286, 20 years. Okay, I haven't even got to Mughals yet. I think we're going to have to do part 2 of this session. Otherwise, this is going to get so condensed that we cannot possibly cover all of this. So, Ghiyasuddin Balban was a very strong sultan. His son was killed in battle defending India against Mongols. Prince Muhammad Waliul Ahad was killed in battle against Mongols. And then we move on to the next dynasty that came to power, the Khalajis, another Afghan family from Afghanistan. They came to power. They fought against Mongols. Then came the Tughlaqs, also a originally Turkic family from slave class who became sultans and kings. They also fought Mongols. And one of the kings among them was Muhammad bin Tughlaq, who governed from 1325 to 1351 for almost 26 years. He was the strongest sultan among the Tughlaqs. And who knows Ibn Battuta? Who knows Ibn Battuta? Ibn Battuta, the Rihla of Ibn Battuta, the memoir, the travelogue of Ibn Battuta is well known among Muslims in Muslim scholarly circles. He was a traveler who came from Morocco and he traveled all the way to India. He visited India at this time when Muhammad bin Tughlaq was governing. Muhammad bin Tughlaq appointed him as the Qadi of Delhi on the Maliki fiqh and then sent him with some presents and gifts for the Chinese emperor. So he sent him as an envoy to the Chinese emperor, and then he was shipwrecked near the south of India, and Ibn Battuta decided to go back to Morocco instead of going back to Delhi because he knew the Sultan will kill him for losing all the things he was given for the Chinese emperor. So all of this is happening. I will now take a huge leap because of the shortage of time. We will go to the Mughals. The Mughals came to power, again a Turkic family originally. They were descendants of Taimur the Lame, who was a conqueror after Genghis Khan, who conquered a large territory in Central Asia, again following the footsteps of Genghis Khan, and he went as far as the Ottomans, and he actually fought against the Ottomans and he captured the Ottoman Sultan. Sultan Bayezid Yildirim was captured by him and killed by him. Okay, so Taimur was very dangerous. He actually invaded India as well in 1398 and devastated Delhi. But from his descendants came a man called Babur, Zahiruddin Babur, who invaded India, and the Mughal dynasty was established in India. And for the Mughals, we need a separate lecture. So what were the achievements of Islam and Muslims in India throughout this period? Muslims produced some of the best poets in Indian history. Some of the best Persian poets came from this period in India. One of them was Amir Khusro. Amir Khusro's poetry is so powerful that to this day people admire it. He was, and there was a rivalry between Persian poets and Indian Persian poets. Persian language became the court language of India. Okay, it was the literary language of India. All the court records, the letters, the correspondence was done in Persian. And the sultans spoke Turkic. They spoke Turkic. But the language of the court was Persian. So Persian language went through a renaissance in India. And scholars, luminaries, hadith scholars, philosophers were produced in this period. And the list is so vast, brothers and sisters, I simply cannot possibly cover all these lists and the achievements they made. For example, in India, you know, the person who measured the circumference of the earth, it was Al-Bayruni. Al-Bayruni, he was in India. Abu Rayhan Al-Bayruni, who was very, very well known as a geographer, was working in India. He actually wrote one of the first histories or one of the first social studies of India, and this was done in the 11th century, early 1000s basically, during the reign of Sultan Mahmud Ghaznavi. Abu Rayhan al-Bayruni wrote this Kitab al-Hind, which is a very thorough study of the Hindu religion and their philosophy and their way of life. A very impressive treatment of what the Hindus are about at that time. And this is how Muslims worked at the time. You know, if you want to live with the people, you have to study them. You have to understand them. You have to understand their sensitivities. You have to know about them to be able to live with them in a friendly setting, to be able to get on with them. Unfortunately, what's happening in Britain nowadays, today, Muslims live here, and Muslims have been here for nearly 50 years or 40 years, and not many Muslims understand the British culture, the British psyche, the British sentiments, British feelings. We don't. We don't study our counterparts. We don't study the people we live with. We don't study the history. We don't even explain the history of Islam in Britain. And that's another lecture we should have in the future. Islam in Britain. Wallahi, that history will blow your minds away. It will simply completely blow you away because of the contribution Muslims have made in this region. So India, if we study the Mughal period alone, when they governed for nearly 3 centuries. Mughals governed parts of India for 3 centuries. And they made huge contributions to an extent that I want to quickly share something with you. I have a book with me. Mughals were so influential in promoting the Muslim civilization in India that they had Islamified or Persianified, how can I put it? Or Persian, sorry? Persianized, yes, they had Persianized the native people of the land. Even the Hindus had become Persianized. I will give you an example. I will show you an example of this, a living example in front of me very quickly. This is an original manuscript from my book collection. It is a handwritten book from the Mughal period, penned during the reign of Aurangzeb Alamgir. Okay, Aurangzeb Alamgir, and this is for the people who will be looking at it later. This is a Persian book written in a very lavish text called the Shikasta text, which is curvy text, which is very stylish in its way of expression. And this particular manuscript was written by a Hindu, and his name is Amr Singh. And at the end of the manuscript, you clearly read when it was written. It was written on the 3rd of Dhul Qa'dah, year 42 of the Emperor Alamgir, Aurangzeb Alamgir, who governed from 1658 to 1707. And this particular manuscript was penned in 1109 Hijri. So why is a Hindu writing the history of Muslim saints? The book is titled Sirul Arafin. Sirul Arafin basically is a history of Muslim saints of India. Muslim spiritual mystical figures of India. So why is a Hindu writing the history of Muslim saints of India in the Persian language in this script called the Shikasta text, and he is paying a lavish tribute through the emperor? And this particular manuscript was penned in Lahore, the city of Lahore. Okay, this is to show you that the Mughal Empire, the Mughal civilization was so influential and so powerful that even the Hindus had become Persianized or Islamified. Okay, when you read this book from the beginning, when you look at the first page, it clearly states on the top, a Hindu scribe writing Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Okay? A Hindu scribe who has written this very manuscript is writing Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Okay? Persian. The whole book is in Persian. In Arabic, Rasmul Khat. The alphabets are Arabic. So what happened to Hindus in India? What happened to them? They knew the Sanskrit. but they had become so influenced by the Muslim civilization that they had become Islamified. They were using Islamic language. In many cases, many Hindus came to Islam because of the beauty of Islamic culture and Islamic tradition in India at the time during the Mughals. I cannot paint all the Mughals as the same because they were different. Different kings did different things at different times in different places, right? But generally speaking, the Mughals had a very positive impact on the Indians. You know, I can talk about the Taj Mahal, I can talk about the Red Fort, I can talk about the Mughal monuments and the buildings and the art on tombs and the calligraphy and illumination of buildings and all that. I can talk about that. But the real achievement of the Mughals in India was their tolerance towards the masses. The coexistence of the Muslims and the Hindus and the others under the Mughal rule. The Mughals provided that justice, that stability of state. It wasn't perfect. It was never perfect because those times were chaotic. Wars, rebellions caused problems. But if you look at the norm, people lived in enough peace to be able to write books like that and pen Qur'ans in their thousands. This is a Qur'an again from the Mughal period, handwritten, possibly from the same period of Aurangzeb Alamgir or his father Shah Jahan. Thousands of them were penned at this point, in this period. So a lot of these things, when we look at them, and I recommend strongly a book written by a scholar called Audrey Trushk. She has written a book titled The Culture of Encounters, Sanskrit at the Mughal Court or in the Mughal Court, a culture or the culture of encounters, Sanskrit at the Mughal Court. And another book she has written, which is a short book on one of the emperors in whose reign this particular manuscript was penned, Aurangzeb Alamgir, who was the most Islamic Mughal king. He was the most Islam observant king in the Mughal history, and he was the man responsible for building the Badshahi Mosque in Lahore, which was the largest mosque in the world until other mosques were made later on, right? And he was also responsible for compiling Al-Fatawa Al-Alamgiriya, also known as Al-Fatawa Al-Hindiya, okay? The largest collection of Hanafi jurisprudential opinions in one compendium. It is Al-Fatawa Al-Hindiya, compiled by the orders of Aurangzeb Alamgir. So a lot of contributions can be talked about. If we talk about poets, the list is so vast. If we talk about Urdu language, for example, later on we had Ghalib, an Urdu poet. We had Mir. Okay? Even today, if you look at the Indian language in India, spoken by the Hindus, it is heavily influenced by Muslim vocabulary, Muslim dress code, Muslim culture for that matter. This cannot be taken away from India. So the Muslim civilization in India achieved hugely positive things for the Indians and India. If we were to look at the books and if we were to look at the literary works produced by Muslims throughout the 8th century of rule, or even 7th century of rule, 7 centuries of rule, we cannot possibly cover all these aspects of Muslim civilization in a short lecture of 1 hour. No, we need a lecture series on every single aspect. For example, Muslim poetry in India, Muslim theology in India, Muslim philosophy in India, Muslim science in India, Muslim military tactics or military skills in India, Muslim contribution to Indian architecture, Muslim contribution to the intellectual development of Indian intellectuals, Muslim contribution to the freedom movement against the British East India Company and later on the British Empire. Wallahi, the list is so long that we cannot possibly. Muslim freedom fighters, kings like Tipu Sultan. Tipu Sultan, again, this is another lecture in itself. The man was killed in battle in 1799 against the East India Company forces, and he was so sophisticated that his name is among one of the inventors of rockets. If you go to the American Rocket Institute, if that's what it's called, you will see his name among one of the inventors. Tipu Sultan. Google when you go home. This is your homework. Tipu Sultan. Tipu Sultan. Very little known to Muslims outside of India, unfortunately. A very powerful figure to remember. He was no less than Sultan Salahuddin al-Ayyubi. No less when you study his history. He was a master diplomat. His diplomacy was absolutely amazing. He sent emissaries to Thomas Jefferson. You know who Thomas Jefferson is? The author of the Declaration of Independence, 1776. He sent emissaries to the Turkish Sultan. He sent emissaries to the French king, Louis XVI. And then after that to Napoleon Bonaparte. Why? Because he wanted to liberate India from the British East India Company. Because the British East India Company was bleeding India dry. Who says so? Not Tipu Sultan, not I. The British officers working within the East India Company themselves. There is a book written at that time. It was published in 1772. And the book was titled The British Transactions in Bengal. The British Transactions in Bengal. It was published by William Bolts. B-O-L-T-S. William Bolts. He exposed the business of the East India Company in 3 provinces of India, which were occupied by the British East India Company. The British went to India as traders during the Mughal period. They came when the Mughals were at their peak, the peak of their power. The Mughals were the most powerful political entity in the world, starting from an emperor called Jalaluddin Muhammad Akbar, then his son Jahangir, Nuruddin Jahangir, then his son Shahabuddin Shah Jahan, the builder of Taj Mahal, and then his son Aurangzeb Alamgir. These 4 kings, they witnessed or they saw or they facilitated the peak of the Indian empire in the world. During the reign, nearly 50 years reign of Aurangzeb Alamgir, from 1658 to 1707, India was the richest country in the world. It has been never so rich, before and after. And Aurangzeb Alamgir is the most maligned Muslim king in Indian history because of his Islam. But he made India a formidable power. Never before India witnessed so much power. 24% of global GDP, 24% of global GDP was in India during the reign of Aurangzeb Alamgir. This is how powerful India was. He was the richest man in the world. And yet, he would sleep on a mat. He memorized the Quran after he became the emperor. When he was over 40 years old, he would write the Qurans in his own hand, and he would deliver justice personally for his subjects. When he would hear one of his sons or one of his cousins or one of his relatives is abusing power, he would personally get involved, and he would have amends made. So Aurangzeb Alamgir was that. But then after his death in 1707, within 50 years of his death, the Mughals went downhill immediately. The succeeding emperors were a bunch of weaklings. They were busy in debauchery. They were having fun. They harems. They're singing and dancing. They're smoking of shisha or hookah or all of that. This is what they were busy in. Okay, and then political power was lost. In 1757, the British fought a war against the Mughals and defeated them. And then they woke up to the potential of India. They realized that they can possibly own India. In their wildest dreams, these merchants working for a company, a trade company called the British East India Company, they could never imagine that they will one day become the masters of India, the richest country in the world. What Britain is today is one of the richest countries in the world, right? A huge proportion of the British wealth or the gold reserves of the Bank of England, a huge part of it comes from India. I tell you that without hesitation. Okay, if you don't believe me, read the book of Shashi Tharoor titled The Dark Empire. The Dark Empire. Okay, Shashi Tharoor. So the British came to power in 1757, and slowly and gradually, by plotting, by planning, which anyone would do, we can't blame them for that. Okay, British East India Company wanted to get its hands on power and own India, which they successfully did. They could not claim, however, ownership of India until this man called Tipu Sultan was killed in 1799. Why he was killed? Who was he? What are his achievements? Please either listen to my lecture on him on YouTube, the biography of Tipu Sultan, or read a book on him called The Tiger of Mysore by Kate Brittlebank. Kate Brittlebank. And Tipu Sultan was the last giant standing in India. Until Tipu Sultan was alive, the British could never claim racial or cultural or religious or political superiority over the native Indians. It was only in the 1820s, after Tipu Sultan was killed and the Muslim political power was removed completely from the Indian landscape, then the British could claim racial superiority. Then racism could be seen in the government policies. It could be seen how communications were done between the British officials. I recommend two books strongly to understand this point, by a British author. His name is William Dalrymple. William Dalrymple has written two books on this very topic. To understand what I'm talking about, read White Mughals. White Mughals by William Dalrymple, and The Last Mughal by the same author. And you will get the end of the Muslim empire or Muslim civilization in the Indian subcontinent. And what remains of the Muslim civilization in the Indian subcontinent, politically speaking, is Pakistan. Pakistan is a nuclear power, and Pakistan is, in political rivalry against India. Unfortunately, we don't want to see this. Pakistani leaders and leadership has made it amply clear that they do not want war with India. They don't want hostilities with India. Rather, they want a relationship of friendship. They want friendliness or friendship with India, not hostility and war. And the story continues. The story continues. Thank you so much for listening. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Do apologize for the long lecture. We will do a short Q&A, and if it needs to be long, then we will prolong it until the battery of my phone dies. We can continue. Yes, please.
Thank you very much for...
Okay, before you go, everyone, I have some artifacts here for your perusal. These are some of the Quran pages from the Mughal period. They are calligraphy from the Mughal period. Okay, they are 300 to 400 years old. They're from the Mughal period. They are original, right? So these are basically for £10 each. Okay, we're giving them away so that we can use this money for protecting and conserving and accumulating more manuscripts like this. This is what we're doing with manuscripts. This is my private project, okay, funded by me, owned by me. What I'm doing is I'm acquiring these manuscripts, some from our ancestral library. I'm trying to preserve them, and some from other sources, right? And we get them bound. We get them bound like this in leather, and we get them conserved. Where there's worm damage, we get it repaired. So this prolongs the life of a manuscript like this for maybe 3 to 4 centuries. again, okay, and they will survive hopefully. Likewise, this Quran, if you saw it when we acquired it, you wouldn't believe it is the same Quran. So this is the project we're spending the money on. And I have some Mughal coins from the Mughal period, right? So you can look at those. And even this Quran, Quran, if anyone is interested in it, let me know, inshallah ta'ala. We will use these funds in this project to conserve, to protect Muslim heritage, inshallah, in the form of manuscripts and numismatics. Thank you. Continue, please.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
Thank you very much for your informative lecture. I have some questions. Maybe some part of history, I don't know. I haven't heard that. Speaking to them. You know that the first Europeans who reached to India were the Portuguese. So they came and they colonized the western side of
Goa.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I want to know why didn't the Sultans fight them and put them out from that coast? They spent like around maybe 100 years in the Indian Ocean. That's question number one.
Let me answer that question very quickly. Okay. Portuguese were a maritime power. They were very, very strong in sea activity. They were expert seamen. They were involved in piracy. They were gangsters of the sea. And because they were experts of that science, you see, some fields they cannot be mastered by money and gold and silver. They are mastered by experience. The Portuguese had huge experience in maritime activity. So they took full advantage of it and they occupied these coastal cities of India. And they were effectively insignificant for the Mughals. Mughals didn't care about those cities, and that's why they left the Portuguese in their little circles, like the city of Goa today, right? Later on, the British fought them and reduced their territory even more. You know, there were Dutch in India. They tried their luck, and the British fought them away. The French were there. There were French colonies in India, right? And they were driven away by the British. So the Muslims did not fight them because they were, they had strong naval experience. And the Mughals never put enough emphasis on building.
You're saying the English shrink them?
Yes, eventually. It were the English who shrunk the Portuguese territory, not the Mughals. The Mughals didn't really care about them.
Actually, the Muslims kicked them out from there.
From
the whole Indian Ocean, who kicked them out? The Omanis.
The Omanis, okay. Now that's the history I'm not aware of.
Yeah.
That's the history I'm not aware of. So the Omanis were fighting the Portuguese, yes, okay. I'm not aware of that history, so I wouldn't be able to talk about
And
that.
they took over all their...
Right. Ottomans fought the Portuguese, and in 1571 there was a huge battle, the Battle of Lepanto, which the Ottomans lost. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, or Suleiman Kanuni, he fought this battle against the joint naval fleets of Europe. You know, they were French, they were Spanish, they were Portuguese. All of them joined hands against the Ottomans, and the Ottomans lost, and they recovered. Although the value of that battle was highly exaggerated by European historians at the time, but it was not as significant because the Ottomans recovered soon after, right? So the Mughals were not a naval power. They were not a naval power. In fact, even for Hajj journeys, they depended on the Portuguese. Yes, that's the problem. Anyone, can we come back to your question?
Okay.
Yeah, if anyone, yes, please, go ahead. We'll take turns, inshallah, Sheikh. Yes.
I just wanted to ask about, do you have any suggestions for books on the rise of the poetry and the literature of the Mughal period?
Many books.
Or just like a starter?
If you want to read an introduction on the Mughals, F.F. Richards, The Mughals, the book is called. Another book I would strongly recommend if you need to know how Mughal royal households worked, then Mughal Princes by Munis Farooqi, Mughal Princes. Okay, these are recent books. And Audrey Trushk's, okay, Audrey Audrey, Audrey, Trucshke. It's a very strange name, but she's an American scholar, and she has received a lot of hate towards her on Twitter. She's a warrior. She's a warrior. She's not a Muslim, by the way. She's an academic from the US. She's teaching at one of the American universities, and she receives tons of hate every single day on Twitter from India, because she paints the Muslim history as a positive thing, you know. Audrey Trushk. Trucshke. Trushk. Yeah. She's on Twitter as well, by the way. You go and check her Twitter and you'll see what she goes through every day. She recently lectured in India and she was heckled by the crowd. And then there was another side which was protecting her, defending her. So India is going through a very, revisionist. I mean, there are two groups in India now. Though the BJP, the extreme right-wing, extremist Hindutva side, and the other side is the secular, educated, enlightened side as well. Yes. Anyone? Yes, please.
Yes. The second question is about manuscripts.
Yes.
Also, I'm interested in manuscripts. So I want to know what is the oldest manuscript you have found, or if it is in your hand, if it is like kept in some of the private libraries, and are they in Arabic? And if they are in Arabic, have they been published, like edited and published, or to what extent they are still manuscript that keeping knowledge as they are protected and not
published? You see, the first step is to protect them, preserve them, conserve them. That's the first step, and then publishing comes later. The first thing we are struggling with is to protect them, to somehow protect them against destruction. Okay, and the oldest we have may be 800 years old in our personal library, our ancestral library, because I inherited a lot of books in Arabic. In Arabic is a book on fiqh. Then we have Qur'ans, very old, about 600 to 700 years old. So we know from the khat, from the writing, we know that these are old. Okay, and from the paper as well, you can tell. And so we have a number of books from that period. Many haven't been published. To be honest with you, I don't even know what's there in my ancestral library. I haven't fully gone through it. There's a lot. My ancestors acquired a lot of books. They have left them behind for us, and we want to take care of them. And there are others we know people who have libraries who have these books. We buy these books from them as well and try to preserve them. Yeah, this is what we do. Anyone else? No more questions? Yes, please. Sorry, what was I talking about? Alamgir, yeah. Aurangzeb Alamgir. Aurangzeb. Aurangzeb Alamgir is his second name. Alamgir. Google him and you will see who he is. Yes. Okay. Anyone else? Yes.
Just I'm confused. You mentioned some dates, so I'm not sure which system is that. Is it the Islamic?
No. I mentioned common era dates. I mentioned the common era. The Gregorian calendar dates. Yeah, I didn't mention the Islamic dates because unfortunately, most students here wouldn't be able to appreciate the Islamic dates because we are not Islamically trained, unfortunately. This is the problem we are facing. We need a revival of Islamic dates. Yes, we need it.
We are speaking
yes.
About Islamic
history. Yes.
And whatever you have mentioned was not recorded ever.
Yes.
In the English books, never.
Yes.
All the books that we read about this, his period of history.
Yes.
It was Islamic.
Yes.
And
all of them use Islamic dates.
Yeah. So I prefer that we link the two because
yes.
When we say
even this manuscript written by a Hindu, the date he writes is the Islamic date because the British haven't yet come to power in India. It was after colonialism and the rise of Western imperialism when the common era date became universal. Before that, the Islamic Hijri date was the date of the world. That was the system which was used by the most educated people in the world. And then when Muslim civilization lost its political hegemony or political influence in the world, that's when the Common Era date came on top. Yes. Anyone else? Okay, thank you so much for listening. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk.